All right, thanks, Megan. And thanks to Albino, Marta, and Zach for the invitation to speak. I can see my slides. Here's my slides. Okay. So I'm going to present kind of some theoretical arguments to put forward a rational case against the concept of an internal world model. So what do I mean by that? I mean this kind of idea, which is pretty ubiquitous in neuroscience, psychology, that we kind of internalize some kind of approximate representation of the external world within our own brains. And there's many references one can choose to speak to that idea. I, for example, like this book, the short book by Kenneth Craig, I think it was published in the 40s, where he kind of introspects about his own mind and comes to the conclusion that he's using some sort of internal representation of the external world to sort of future predict and sample different possibilities of what might happen in order to determine what decisions he makes, what actions he selects, and so on and so forth. This is also, consistent with the work that of Tolman that David mentioned. I think it's interesting to kind of imagine that these two guys, Kenneth Craig and Tolman, were kind of coming to the same conclusion around the same time, as far as unbeknownst to each other, and thank you, from completely different perspectives. One from kind of an animal behavior perspective, and from Craig's angle, he's coming at more from a kind of human subjective experience perspective. So, just to give you an example of the kind of computations that are proposed to that these internal world models are used for, I'm going to simulate a simulation in the game of X's and O's, which is a simple board game that we all know. Just to emphasize that all the theoretical arguments I'm going to make here are totally independent of the specific environment I'm going to present. And it's going to be quite a general idea, but I just thought this is sort of an intuitive example that hopefully many people are familiar with. And also this picture is quite a nice picture to use. One thing maybe you can't see is there's lots of lines between these black dots, where each of these dots is a different state of the game, and each line between these dots is a possible transition in the game. So for example, the game of X's and O's starts with an empty 3x3 grid. One player puts in an X, the other player puts in an O, and the game proceeds, like so on and so forth, through the state space. And this particular trajectory ends in a win for the X's. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to refer to this as chronological simulation, because this is a simulation that respects the actual true chronological structure of this game. And I'm going to emphasize that this maps onto the kind of the core function that is proposed that internal world models are for, which is you have a world model inside your own mind, you use it to simulate or make future predictions, and then use that information to infer good behavior. So I'm going to build my kind of argument of two critiques. One of which is that at scale, this is an ineffective methodology for inferring behavior. And the second thing I'll point out, coming more from the tradition of Craig, that this is not how humans, particularly expert humans, reason. Regarding the issue of ineffectiveness, one can imagine that you have this sort of state space in your mind, and you want to think about which move to make. It's great if you end up, hit the wrong thing. It's great if you end up randomly selecting this right trajectory, because that leads to win for you as the X's player. But in general, if you have no idea where exactly these winning board states are, and you randomly sample different possible future trajectories, essentially you're just going to miss the good board states for you and end up making bad decisions. From a technical perspective, this sort of maps onto the idea that in micro-decision processes or any kind of large sequential decision-making task, there exists this issue that occurs of dimensionality, which in this context corresponds to or implies kind of a huge sample variance in your kind of sample-based estimation. The second point I'm going to make is that, speaking to expert humans, this is not how expert humans solve these tasks. There are many non-chronological problem-solving heuristics that expert humans make use of. For example, this book and other work that particularly people like Alan Newell and Herbert Simon produced in the kind of 50s, 60s, and 70s characterized qualitatively many of these non-chronological human problem-solving heuristics. For example, ideas like preconditioning, parallelization, situational analysis, principle least commitment, which I will kind of tap on a little bit in the future elements of my presentation. And it hasn't kind of translated into much focus in kind of modern machine learning and AI, because this, in some sense, this was part of this symbolic AI component of AI, in contrast to the kind of connectionist program, which led to deep learning and then combined with reinforcement learning, produced deep reinforcement learning. So, but I think it's a really important set of qualitative descriptions about human expert problem solving that I think we can use as motivation to think theoretically about how people solve these sorts of problems. And I think it's interesting to emphasize, if you read this book, Alan Newell and Herbert Simon repeatedly refer to these kinds of words like insightfulness and directedness. The idea that there's sort of, that when a human has a real expert understanding of a particular domain, can be very intuitive in jumping to some sort of conclusion without going through many kind of future simulations. So, in the rest of the presentation, I'd like to provide an alternative to this idea. So instead of using a world model, chronologically simulating possible trajectories through these world models, we want to take a different approach and imagine or hypothesize that the actual format of the models we have in our mind, particularly in the kind of limit of expert sequential decision makers, takes the form of a model that facilitates what I'm going to call teleological simulation, which is simulations that are specifically designed to efficiently infer behavior. I'm going to argue that is not the same thing as a chronological simulation. So just to get a little bit more technical, but I try to keep the maths to minimum as we converge on the coffee break. So the kind of standard computational perspective in these sorts of problems is called market decision processes. The idea is you have some kind of state space. For example, these could be board states in the game of X's and O's, and you have some kind of, usually kind of like a graph type model where you have some states and opportunities to transition between states, and you have a reward function that maps from these states to rewards. And one kind of issue that's quite the but I'll just mention it here, just give you kind of intuition. So one of the kind of challenges of these sorts of the kind of standard formulations of reinforcement learning and market decision processes is this type of representation of state space leads to a non-convex objective function. Roughly speaking, it means that the structure of the reward function, which you're trying to maximize, kind of looks like this. So there's lots of kind of like peaks and troughs. So depending on where you start, you might end up in kind of a local maxima, which actually isn't the best possible thing to do in the environment. This kind of issue tends to be overcome in the limit through chronological sampling by many, many very long chronological samples or simulations. However, in work I'm collaborating with Carlos Stein in the lab on, we kind of take a different perspective where we sort of like, in some sense, sort of like disentangle the state space and can conceptualize the state space more in terms of paths. So you can see here, all I've done is taken the state space and I've kind of unrolled it into all possible different future simulations that might occur in the state space. And one thing we have to bear in mind is that in general, this path space is going to be infinite dimensional in the sense there's going to be an infinite number of possible paths, in this particular case, due to this kind of cycle or recurrent loop in the state space. So this operation leads to a kind of a difficulty, which is the infinite dimensionality, but leads to a kind of a useful feature of this kind of modeling is that now the reward function becomes convex, okay? Which means if I somehow am able to overcome this infinite dimensionality of this path space, then all I have to do is gradient descent, and I'm guaranteed to arrive at the optimal policy in this case. Maybe before we get to that, one can imagine a way of conceptualizing a solution to this kind of representation of the problem, which is instead of thinking about the problem as a sequence of decisions, we've kind of thought about it as a single decision over sequences. Okay, and in some sense, that's in theory that could be like an easy decision, particularly if you have a very small number of possible future trajectories. And in that case, you can just argmax over it and make a single decision over your finite number of trajectories. This, as I said, doesn't work in general because this is an infinite dimensional problem. So one piece of work that we've done is that although you cannot argmax over and just make a single decision over these infinite number of paths, there's actually a way of reformulating the problem so you can actually analytically compute gradients and execute planning via gradient descent mechanism. Okay, so just to kind of summarize at a kind of high level, by unrolling the state space like this, we kind of gain the benefit of simplifying the problem to a certain extent. And actually, it turns out there's a finite parameterization of the gradients in this space, so we can descend this surface in order to find the optimal policy down in the kind of fixed point down here. To summarize the two main qualities of this type of approach, which kind of forms the basis of my kind of rational argument against the standard formulation of internal world models, is that this is an effective approach for solving sequential decision-making environments because it enjoys two features. One is global optimality, which refers to the convex nature of the objective function in the space. And the other perspective is the issue of time optimality. And in particular, this type of approach to planning organizes the planning process. You have what's called in computer science an anytime computational property, which means that as long as you run this algorithm, you will always get back the best possible policy for the amount of time you put into it. Okay? So the way I think about this is that imagine you had an infinitely powerful autonomous agent, like a super AI or something, and the only constraint it has is time. Then this would be the best way to plan for that agent. Okay. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll just run through a couple of examples where we just simulate these gradient descent dynamics, which are specified here, and map it onto several of these non-chronological human problem-solving heuristics that people like Alan Newell and Herbert Simon investigated in the kind of 50s, 60s, and 70s under the rubric of symbolic AI. And in order to do that, we need some kind of way of visualizing the kind of internal structure of the planning process. So I'm going to use these kinds of measures, like a change in state occupation. So I'm going to explain this in the context of a binary choice paradigm. So here we have a start state. There's a reward at this state. There's no reward here. The agent should choose to go in this direction. What I'm plotting here is a change of state occupation as I solve this task using this algorithm I just alluded to. So, roughly speaking, without going to the maths, basically saying that if this line goes up, the algorithm is saying that I want to spend more time in this state. If this line goes down, you see I'm color coding by state here. If this line goes down, it means that I want to spend less time in this state here. So in that sense, the algorithm must solve the task because it's telling the agent to go here, not here. Let's do a more complex environment with a non-trivial hierarchical structure. So these sorts of grid worlds are kind of standard, simple arenas that we investigate reinforcement learning algorithms. The problem here is the agent has to find its way from the start state up here to this reward state up here. I've color-coded the rooms just for visualization. The agent has no information about that. And I can see here I've kind of like, with a sort of I've depicted the density of the optimal solution. The idea is to go through this route into this reward location here. On the right side here, I'm plotting this change in state occupation function we just described If these lines, which are color-coded by state, go up, it means the algorithm is deciding that I want to spend more time at this state. If the lines go down, it means the algorithm is deciding that I do not want to spend time at that state. The first thing you'll notice is that if we start at time 0, one can intuit that we have just a random walk policy which doesn't know where to go, and in general, it just will not go to the reward location here. You can imagine this as the kind of simulation policy of the agent, which in general is going to be highly noisy and not very useful to find an reward, which is over here. If you run our algorithm, it integrates information about the environment in such a way that kind of at an intermediate state focuses on increasing the state occupation of these blue states in here, as if the algorithm sort of, in an emergent sense, knows the sort of a hierarchical structure of the state space and knows that if I get into the blue room, then once I'm into the blue room, I can ultimately find the reward here. Going back to the work of kind of Newell and Simon and so forth, one would think of that as a preconditioning. So the idea is that in order to solve this task, to get to the goal in this area here, a precondition for that is being in the blue room, which is essentially what the algorithm focuses and implicitly focuses on first. If you continue this process and keep refining the plan or the behavior of the agent, one ends up identifying the optimal policy as expected from our kind of global optimality arguments. Okay. So in this visualization, I'm going to use a different perspective, and that is instead of imagining that I'm evaluating or visualizing the change of state occupation or the rate at which the agent goes to one state or the other, what this curve reflects is the degree to which the agent is changing the policy at this state here. So if this goes up, it means the algorithm is deciding that at this state, I need to do something different. Something's important to be done, needs to be done at this state. So if you, for example, if you use this in a decision tree structure you see, it's kind of hard to see in the color scheme here, but there's sort of this backward induction across states where first off, when it tries to solve from the start location to its goal location, first figures out I need to do something important at this state, then this state, then this state. In some sense, we can read out like a prioritization of the algorithm across states by using the time derivatives of these curves. So I have to go a little bit quick through these. When I apply this to a standard kind of executive reasoning task, that is also, a foundational in the study of human problem solving. It's a Tower of Hanoi task. The idea here is that you have to move these blocks from this configuration into this configuration. This is the state space here. We want to get from this location here to this location here in the state space. And just to briefly point out is that the sequence of prioritizations the algorithm identifies is non-chronological in the sense it starts by identifying this is the goal location, then identifies the kind of key bottleneck here, and then it continues, so on and so forth. So it produces sort of this sequence of hierarchical preconditioning type reasoning, identifies what the stop state is, where it needs to end up, and then the kind of precondition to arriving there, the most important one is moving the large disk, and then to facilitate the movement of the large disk, it now identifies the next precondition, which is to make space a large disk, and so on and so forth. So to go back to the example of the decision tree, one thing that I could imagine is that an agent here, if it was simulating in a non-chronological way, might be able to figure out what to do at this point here without knowing what it's going to do in the future. Okay? This maps onto the qualitative descriptions of human problem solving as a principal least commitment. I'm only going to commit what I need to do now, and I can identify what I can plan for later on. So in some sense, the simulation just gave you doesn't do that, because it actually solves backwards by backwards induction from the goal location to the start state. It's also a result that you get from kind of future simulations If I simulate from the start to the goal, I know all my decisions along the trajectory. However, there's a kind of subtle manipulation of our algorithm which allows you to situate the dynamics of the planning process. And actually, you can flip the prioritization of the algorithm around such that you can force it to plan at this start state and identify the most important decision to be done right now without knowing what it needs to be doing in the future. Okay? And that's kind of a relatively unusual feature of planning algorithms. Excuse me, so I'll just skip the last example. You can ask me about its connection to the success representation, maybe for the RL aficionados. And I'll leave you with a visualization. So chronological simulation starts from the start and simulates to the end. Here we have a different perspective. We refer to teleological simulation, which sorts of generates kind of emergent patterns of reasoning consistent with human problem solving, but sort of integrates that information kind of consistently and globally across the state space with better effectiveness guarantees. Thank you.